It is important to clarify that ancient Rome was a society with a long history, and practices regarding slavery evolved over time. Slavery was a pervasive institution in ancient Rome, and slaves were considered property without any legal rights or personality. It is essential to recognize that slavery in ancient Rome was a deeply rooted social and economic institution, and that it persisted for centuries. However, our understanding of history must be based on the evidence of historical documents and archaeological finds, being aware of the limits of our knowledge due to the passage of time. In today's video, we will tell you about the unspeakable things masters did to slaves in ancient Rome. But before we get into the video, make sure you subscribe to our channel and press that bell icon to never miss an update. While there were certainly cases of extreme cruelty and abuse inflicted on slaves, it is essential to approach this issue sensitively and avoid using exaggerated or sensational language. Historical records reveal cases of mistreatment and inhumane treatment, but we must remember that the experiences of slaves in ancient Rome varied widely and were not uniform. In the Roman world, there were many different ways to force someone into slavery. These included children born into slavery, people captured during war, people sold or self-sold into slavery, and children abandoned at birth. Less common were children sold by their parents, people enslaved for debt or as punishment for crimes, and people who were victims of kidnapping and piracy. We know of two slave markets in the city of Rome. One was near the Temple of Castor in the Forum, the other near Septa Julia on the Field of Mars. Romans also traded enslaved people across and within the borders of Roman territory. In imperial times, 27 BC to AD 476, imported people could come from areas just beyond the Roman frontiers: Ireland, Scotland, Eastern European countries bordering the Rhine and Danube, the Black Sea area, the Arabian Peninsula, and Africa. However, enslaved people could also come from within the borders of the Roman Empire, for example from Thrace, Asia Minor, and Syria. As mentioned by the Roman writer Varro, the city of Ephesus, on the coast of modern-day Turkey, was a center for the Roman slave trade. When Roman authors do reference an enslaved person's origin, it's usually a province in the empire's borders, such as Cappadocia and Phrygia, both modern-day Turkey or Syria. The issue of race and slavery in Roman times is a complex one. In the Roman world, slaves came from a variety of ethnic backgrounds, often the same as their masters. Merchants had to reveal the origin of the people they sold, indicating that the Romans considered certain personal characteristics, physical strength, character, and behavior, as linked to someone's origin. These, in turn, could discourage or encourage buyers. In a letter written during Caesar's invasion of Britain in 55 BC, Cicero jokes about the improbability of finding British slaves educated in literature or music. Slavery in ancient Rome is well documented. Various literary sources, legal documents, inscriptions, and artistic representations show what common slaves were like in everyday life. However, we do not know the exact numbers, which makes it difficult to fully understand its importance to Roman society and its economy. Surviving evidence shows that the slaves had a wide range of occupations. Many did heavy manual labor under close supervision, but could also perform more specialized activities with a greater degree of autonomy. Some were very self-sufficient and were even responsible for other enslaved people, known as vicari. The price of a slave in ancient Rome varied greatly depending on the gender, age, and ability of the individual. Based on literary and documentary sources, the average price of an unskilled or moderately skilled slave during the first 3 centuries AD was around 2,000 sesterces. To give an idea of the scale, in the 1st century AD, a legionnaire, a Roman foot soldier, received a salary of 900 sesterces a year, less than 600 after deductions for rations, boots, and hay. An ordinary centurion, commander of a legionnaire, was paid 15 times as much, and he only needed to set aside his salary for a few months to pay for a slave. Types of slavery. Physical abuse. Slaves were often subjected to physical punishment, including whipping, beating, and other forms of violence. This was used as a means of control and to instill fear. Forced labor. Slaves were primarily used for labor, working in mines, farms, households, and construction projects. They often worked long hours under harsh conditions. Sexual exploitation. Female slaves, in particular, were vulnerable to sexual exploitation by their owners or other individuals. Separation of families. Families could be torn apart when members were sold to different owners, leading to emotional trauma and loss. Lack of legal protection. Slaves had no legal rights and could not seek justice or protection against mistreatment. Gladiatorial games. Some male slaves were forced to become gladiators, engaging in life and death combat for the entertainment of the public. Under Roman law, slaves had no personal rights and were considered the property of their masters. They could be bought, sold, and abused at will, and could not legally own property, enter into a contract, or marry. Some of the worst working conditions were in the mines or quarries. The slaves were forced to work tirelessly in deep, dark, and narrow tunnels. The work was physically demanding and dangerous, with the tunnels in danger of collapsing. Although they play an important role in urban economies, ancient legal sources do not list slaves as employees, but instead as the instrumenta, tools, or equipment of a business or workshop. Most have been trained in a specific trade or profession, as agents, managers, or salespeople. However, no matter how competent or self-sufficient they were, their masters were always legally responsible for their actions. Records from the time focus on the misbehavior of the slaves rather than their achievements. Slaves were often found in Roman houses. Traces of their presence can be found in archaeological records and in numerous depictions in art and literature. When referenced in ancient texts, they are often identified by their tasks, giving the impression of a large number of different roles and specialties. Just as enslaved people in urban occupations were seen as part of the workshop in which they worked, those in the domestic environment were part of a landlord's property, and their numbers reinforced the landlord's status. Slaves were often found in Roman houses. Traces of their presence can be found in archaeological records and in numerous depictions in art and literature. When referenced in ancient texts, they are often identified by their tasks, giving the impression of a large number of different roles and specialties. Just as enslaved people in urban occupations were seen as part of the workshop in which they worked, those in the domestic environment were part of a landlord's property, and their numbers reinforced the landlord's status. Enslaved people who worked in the home mostly enjoyed a better quality of life than those who worked in the mines or fields, but they could also be victims of physical and sexual abuse. Generally, they had to perform tasks without being seen, except when serving a banquet. There are also examples of executions as punishment for enslaved people working in households. In AD 61, under the reign of the Emperor Nero, a distinguished senator was murdered by one of his household staff. Despite protests by the people, Nero backed the Senate's decision to uphold an existing law. It stipulated that all enslaved members of the owner's household should be executed, a ruthless collective punishment intended as a deterrent. Now the question is how the slaves got their freedom. Individuals could be released by manumission, a procedure by which a master could grant freedom to his servants. Manumission rates in ancient Rome are unknown, and it is unknown how many times people were released. It is believed that those who work in cities are more likely to have the right to vote than those who work in rural areas. Enslaved people could be officially freed in 3 ways: by registering on the census list, by trial in the presence of a magistrate, or if freedom was granted by the will of a master. However, once free individuals became citizens, they continued to owe duties to their former masters and were ineligible for public office. Marriage was another path to freedom, open almost exclusively to enslaved women freed by male owners to legally marry together and have legitimate children. These unions were unequal because the husbands were entitled to a greater degree of control. Liberated wives also had fewer rights than non-liberated wives, or even liberated women who married men who were not their masters. Slavery in ancient Rome was undoubtedly an egregious aspect of Roman society by today's standards. But for the Romans, at least for those who were born free, it was completely normal and accepted as a necessary part of everyday life. Slavery in the so-called civilized Western countries was not declared illegal until the 19th century. Despite this, it still exists today in many countries of the world in various forms. Arguably, slavery in ancient Rome led to many more centuries of forced servitude, cruelly imposed by one human being on another. That's all for today. Let us know your views in the comments section below, and don't forget to like this video before leaving. Thanks for watching.